Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so glad you're having great conversations with each other, and I wish that there was more time for lunch, but there will be more time later this afternoon for you all to connect and compare notes. Right now, however, we are going to start our session on cracking the case. Journalists reveal the influence behind the elections. I'm Deborah Ehrenberg. I'm the Director of State Affairs at Justice at Stake. And with me on the stage are Vivica Novak from the Center for Responsive Politics, Pema Levy from Mother Jones Magazine, Phil Williams from News Channel 5 in Nashville, and Jorge Valencia from WUNC, North Carolina. And as fair courts advocates, information is a truly powerful tool, both in terms of educating the public about the influences behind judicial elections, behind trying to influence the courts, as well as allowing us to have the information that we need to truly make an effective case. And each of these journalists have helped contribute to that body of knowledge, both for our field as well as to help inform the public, make the public more aware that this is an issue that needs to be of concern. So I'm not going to spend any more time on on introducing the session right now. You all understand how important the media is to this issue. I want to give these folks plenty of time to talk about their own research, what they found. We're going to have some discussion amongst ourselves, and as we've been doing, we will then open it for you all to write your questions on note cards, and we'll have people pick them up and bring them to me so we can weave them into the conversation. So, Vivica, why don't you get us started?
Okay. And I'm going to stand up here because I want to be able to see my PowerPoint, which is there. So before I did what I'm doing now, I was a reporter with more legacy media organizations like the Wall Street Journal and Time Magazine. And with a background covering legal affairs and politics, I'd always been kind of intrigued and sort of startled by the notion that judges in many states are elected. And it was pretty clear that judicial elections were beginning to look an awful lot like other political races, and spending was going up, and there was an awful lot of money being spent on TV ads, which were kind of the slash and burn variety, not the nice biographical variety. In the mid-2000s, I went to help run a group called factcheck.org, where we checked the truthfulness of political ads. And while I was there, I started a project checking the truthfulness of judicial ads. And what I found, which may not surprise anyone who's watched this area, was that judicial ads are no more truthful than any other ads in any other political race. At the time, I was writing about the Wisconsin Supreme Court and Louis Butler's attempt to get reelected. He was thrown off the court with some extremely deceptive and very effective ads run by his opponent, Mike Gableman, and his allies. There were misleading ads in the face-off for an open court seat in Alabama between Deborah Passer and Greg Shaw. And in Iowa in 2010, groups like the National Organization for Marriage were able to get 3 justices thrown off the court using ads that misportrayed that court's legalization of same-sex marriage. And those were just a few examples. I'm sure you guys have seen more of these than I have. When I moved on to opensecrets.org, where we focus on campaign finance, which is a subject I've always covered as a reporter, I did a lot of work looking into dark money in elections, money spent mostly by 501c4 nonprofit organizations on politics. Most groups that do things like run political ads attacking a candidate have to disclose who their donors are, but not these groups. Their donors remain anonymous, hence the term dark money, and they operate under a special provision of the tax code that's supposed to be for social welfare groups, but allows them to hide their donors. Many of them are highly political. This slide shows in the little pie chart there shows the green is in federal elections in 2014, the percentage of outside group ads run by groups that did not disclose who their donors are. So we were looking at dark money being used in races for Congress and the White House, but my former colleague Peter Stone and I decided, at the request of the Daily Beast, to take a look at the phenomenon in state judicial races. And we did that by tracing the origins and work of something called the Judicial Crisis Network, formerly known as the Judicial Confirmation Network until Obama took office. JCN had popped up in various court elections around the country over the last 5+ years and had spent a fair bit of money, at least by the standards of judicial elections. We talked to conservative sources, but we also dug through state and federal campaign finance records and tax filings and court documents. And what you see here is part of a tax filing that these nonprofits have to submit once a year, which gives some useful information. This is the Schedule I of a Form 990, which lists all the grants that the group gives out. And this is the Judicial Crisis Network's 2012 Schedule I, showing they're giving $500,000 to the Wisconsin Club for Growth, $170,000 to Better Courts Missouri, $225,000 to the Republican State Leadership Committee, which has been very involved in state elections, $750,000 to the American Future Fund, also very involved in state elections, state judicial elections, and so on. So these 990s were a good source for us. These are other parts of the 990s, which show on the first page over there, they show how much they took in. I'm sorry it's not bigger, you probably can't see it, but it shows that, that in this particular year they took in more than $4 million, and it shows how much they gave out in grants. The part on the upper left shows the officers, so it gives you some names to work with if you're trying to pursue this. And the other section there is part of the Schedule B of the 990. Now, these groups don't have to say where they get their money. They have to say who they give it to, but not where they get it. But they do have to disclose a redacted Schedule B, which shows at least the sums that they get from other sources. So you can see that these aren't little dribs and drabs, $5 contributions or whatever, but these are a few sources giving $1 million or $2 million, and more in some cases. So among the, we found that JCN had given about $2 million just in the last 2 years to other groups involved in state judicial elections or involved in efforts to change how judges are chosen in some states. It's given hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years to the Wisconsin Club for Growth, which has spent huge amounts of money getting conservatives elected to the Supreme Court there and gaining the majority, in fact, and also, incidentally, helping Scott Walker in his gubernatorial recall election. They've also given a great deal of money to the Republican State Leadership Committee, which in 2012, just as an example, gave $1.2 million to Justice for All North Carolina, which spent heavily in that year's Supreme Court race. And JCN itself spent $2 million on Michigan court races in 2012, and has also spent money directly on North Carolina and other state races around the country. That $2 million in Michigan included $1 million for a down-ticket race, a state circuit court race in Oakland County, which was a first. So now it's become also heavily involved in helping Republicans win state attorney general slots as part of its overall legal strategy. And so in 2014, Republicans were able to gain 3 more attorneys general positions, which means they now control the majority of states. And as you can see here, JCN was the 3rd largest contributor to the Republican Attorneys General Association last year. JCN has gotten a lot of its money from another dark money group called Wellspring. A lot of these dark money groups like to give money to each other before it gets used so that they have additional cloaks of anonymity, additional layers. But we also learned the name of its initial sugar daddy, the individual who got it started with a lot of money, and some of its other large individual funders who turn out to be big names in the conservative donor community. A lot of you have heard of them. And that we had to get mainly from human sources. Now, I want to stress here that Open Secrets is nonpartisan. There are certainly dark money groups operating on the left. But Democrats haven't been as involved in using these kinds of groups. And Democrats have also not been as involved in trying to shape the courts. Republicans have really prioritized that issue to a greater degree. Yeah, you can see from this, this is a Justice at Stake, Brennan Center National Institute on Money and State Politics publication showing that from 2000 to 2009, plaintiffs' lawyers, unions, and liberal groups were outspent by business and conservative groups, $26.3 million to $11.9 million. And also, according to the same sources, outside groups are accounting for a larger and larger share of TV ad spending in judicial races. And dark money organizations are among those outside groups. I suspect, although we don't have statistics yet, I'm hoping to work on that this year, I suspect dark money is accounting for a larger share than previously. And what does that mean? That means voters often don't know who's helping the candidates who are running to be supposedly impartial dispensers of judges on the state's highest courts. And I'll close with this excerpt from the Citizens United decision in 2010, when the Supreme Court opened the door for a lot more money to get into elections. Open Secrets is not an advocacy group on campaign finance, except on the issue of transparency. We do believe that voters need to know where the money is coming from that's supporting candidates. So we think that's crucial, and so did the Supreme Court in Citizens United, at least in theory. But what we're seeing is, to a great degree, more and more untraceable money in congressional, presidential, and state races, including judicial races, and that's a problem.
Thank you. That's a terrific overview of the national scene and who's trying to influence things. And now we're going to kind of take it down a level and see how these influences play out in specific state races. And for that, Phil, will you tell us about what happened in Tennessee?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me start out by saying this is not a role that I was comfortable with. Because as an investigative reporter, I like to deal with black and white. You know, this is corruption, it's clearly wrong, and I try to stay away from politics as much as I can because politics has so much gray area. But this seemed like a unique opportunity to sort of apply my investigative reporting skills to the world of politics. I was thinking on the plane this morning about a quote from Justice Brandeis from 1913, and I looked it up and I had remembered half of it, but I don't think anyone really remembers the full quote. He said, "Sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants." We all have heard that. He goes on to say, "Electric light, the most efficient policeman." My role in the Tennessee Supreme Court case was to shine that bright light on what was happening, to kind of basically set myself up not as a defender of either side, but as a defender of the truth. Because as they often say, truth is the first casualty of war. Well, truth is also the first casualty of political campaigns, and often with judicial campaigns. And do we have the So just by way of introduction, in August of 2014, 3 of the 5 justices were up for retention elections. Just happened to be the 3 Democratic appointees. So Tennessee Lieutenant Governor Ron Ramsey, who ran for governor and did quite well with the more conservative branch of the party, decided this was a real opportunity because in Tennessee you have a Republican governor, you have a supermajority in the legislature, and he was quite open with, this is our chance to have a Republican judiciary. So, I mean, there was no trying to hide behind what he was doing. He was very upfront and open. My first indication that something might be coming up was I was looking at a conservative website in Tennessee back in March and spotted this story: man back on streets after death row sentence may play into judicial retention election. And reading it struck me as a classic Willie Horton approach. And then as I actually pulled up the case and read it, I'm like, that's not the truth of what happened in this case. And so that's when I really became aware of this issue and started asking around and started calling people that I have as sources. And someone said, well, have you seen the PowerPoint that the Lieutenant Governor is showing to lobbyists? And I was like, no, but tell me more. And so I had a source who went into great detail, giving me details of the PowerPoint. And then I called up the Lieutenant Governor and said, I'm going to do a story on the PowerPoint. Will you give me a copy? And again, he was completely unapologetic about what he was doing. And he said, sure, here's a copy. And then that really gave me a chance to see what is the campaign going to look like, and to go ahead and start fact-checking it from the beginning. Now, as I was saying early on, for me, this was not a comfortable role because I don't want to ever be perceived as being an advocate for the Democrats or an advocate for the Republicans. So I made a very conscious decision that every story I was going to be presenting this as, I'm not defending either side, I'm defending the truth. And over, if you watch all of the stories, you'll hear me asking. In fact, I interviewed Bert and I asked him, how is the public supposed to know what to believe? Because the viewers can relate to that. And the viewers can relate to the fact that it's difficult for them to sort through the various claims. And so by presenting myself as a defender of the truth, that really took me out of the political battle. The other thing that was really important was to find advocates for fair courts who were, in this case, were Republicans. And so you had a Republican critic of a Republican plan. And so again, that helped insulate me from the partisanship involved. And then repeatedly making clear that mine was a commitment to acting as a watchdog. We fact-checked ads, and we attempted to follow the money. I have a video clip here that's about 5 minutes long that will give you just a flavor, and I think it's better than me telling you, but it'll give you a flavor of exactly how my approach of watchdogging this election came about.
All I'm doing is informing people that you only get one chance every 8 years to do this.
Tonight, News Channel 5 investigates a confidential plan to go after 3 members of Tennessee's highest court. That plan was put together by Lieutenant Governor Ron Ramsey's office to convince big business to put up potentially millions of dollars to oust 3 sitting justices.
The Supreme Court of the state of Tennessee is now in session.
It's Tennessee's highest court.
We ask our Supreme Court to do one thing, and that's to follow the law.
5 justices whose one and only job is to do justice.
We don't want them to be biased, way to the right, biased way to the left.
In August, the 3 Democratic appointees on the court face a yes-no vote on whether they should be retained, and Lieutenant Governor Ron Ramsey fears they may not be as friendly to business as he would like.
And we came up with this PowerPoint to be able to show the business leaders where we are.
In this strategy document provided to News Channel 5 Investigates, Ramsey lays out potential points of attack on the 3 justices, portraying them as soft on crime and anti-business. It's a message that Ramsey's taken to people in the business community who could raise millions of dollars for a campaign to oust the 3 judges.
Kind of laid out facts for them, what some of the cases they've overturned, some of the decisions that they've made, and encourage them to not sit on the sidelines.
This is an attack, an unwarranted and unjustified attack on the independence of the judiciary.
In the case of Arthur Copeland, Ramsey's document claims that the court let him out of death row and back into society. What Ramsey does not say is that because Copeland had been convicted on the word of a single eyewitness, the court said the judge should have let an expert tell the jury that eyewitness testimony isn't as reliable as people think. The court ordered a new trial. At the same time, they actually ruled that the death penalty was still an option.
Good for them. I hope they be able to tell their side of the story. We'll tell our side, and may the best man win.
It's not about telling the story. It's about telling the truth.
Surrounded by Capitol Hill reporters, Lieutenant Governor Ron Ramsey faced tough questions over his plan to go after 3 Supreme Court justices who face a yes-no retention vote in August.
This is the same thing exactly as called for in our Constitution, people. Can you not understand that?
But you're proposing a misleading campaign, aren't you?
Oh, come on. No, I'm not misleading. I'll have our side, they'll have their side.
Even the governor expressed concern about Ramsey's idea to turn the election into a referendum on 2 death penalty cases heard by the justices.
As judges, you're restricted in how you can respond to some things. And so I think it's one of the dangers in having an election about specific issues when judges can't comment on those issues.
Well, campaigns are about telling your side of the story, which is what I'm telling. They tell their side of the story, then the people decide.
But are you telling the truth?
Yes, I'm telling the truth.
I mean, right now, Phil, the Tennessee judiciary is not a democracy, it's a hypocrisy.
They are some of the new faces of the opposition to 3 Democratic appointees to the Tennessee Supreme Court who face a vote in August over whether they should be retained.
They've hired people who have, as far as I know, have worked exclusively for Democrats.
Grant Everett Starrett and Ammon Smart are 2 Republican lawyers who make up the nonprofit group Tennesseans for Judicial Accountability. As to who's funding them,
We have no plans to disclose who our donors are.
they say their group was set up as what the IRS considers a social welfare organization, which means they don't have to tell.
Well, as a 501c4 field, we're not advocating whether or not someone should vote for or against retention.
You put out a news release saying that voters should vote against these justices.
I don't recall that being in any of our news releases.
That news release headline, TNJA exposes partisan Democrat state Supreme Court justices, concludes Tennesseans should vote to replace them in August.
But you put out a news release saying that people should vote against these justices.
That was a mistake.
And while the group claims to be nonpartisan, that same news release also makes a number of questionable claims about the justices and their, quote, 7 deadly Democrat sins. For example, the group Justice at Stake has hinted it may get involved in an effort to educate Tennesseans about the importance of keeping the courts independent from partisan interference. Because its funders include a foundation set up by liberal billionaire George Soros, that's listed as one of those deadly Democrat sins.
You leave out the fact that a number of prominent Republicans are involved in that organization.
In Justice at Stake?
Yes.
Can you name some?
I can, as a matter of fact.
In fact, Justice at Stake includes 2 former Republican state Supreme Court justices and retired U.S. Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who was appointed by Ronald Reagan, serves as honorary chair.
Shouldn't you tell voters that Republicans are involved in this
plenty
organization?
of Republicans support Democrats, overall, and Democrat organizations. That doesn't make them, just because Taylor Swift sings at your concert does not make you country.
The campaign for the 3 incumbent justices hit the air first with this positive spot that focused on their oath to support the state and federal constitutions fairly and impartially. Then it adds this.
And they kept their word. protecting individual rights, the Second Amendment right to bear arms, and upholding nearly 90% of death sentences.
Let's stop right there. Upholding 90% of death sentences based on court stats, that appears to check out. But the part saying that they have protected the Second Amendment right to bear arms, the truth is we looked and we could not find a single case where the Second Amendment was ever an issue. A spokesperson insisted that their oaths to the Constitution would include the Second Amendment, but this section talks about what they've done, and even she could not point to a specific case.
Now, this weekend, the Campaign for the Justices held a news conference to denounce the truthfulness of the new attack ad, but take a look at what happened on social media. The headline on our story read, "Justice's Campaign calls new ad absolutely false." But when Supreme Court opponents posted that story, they used social media tools to make it appear that our headline said something else. Their version, "Liberal Supreme Court justices can't handle the truth." Again, that is not the real headline. Tennessee Supreme Court justices are scheduling inmates to die just to save their jobs. That incredible claim is coming from the head of a group that wants to oust 3 incumbent judges. So is it true? News Channel 5 Chief Investigative Reporter Phil Williams continues to check the facts.
You know, it really is an incredible claim, and in a word, it's not true.
All I'm doing is informing people that you only get one chance.
That's starting over again. Now, my photographer who helped me pull together this video did a little fact check on me there at the end, and when I say in a word, it's not true, he pointed out it's 3 words, but that gives you a flavor. And we were talking beforehand, the justices ran campaign ads that were very high level, no specific claims, except for that one spot there that I highlighted. The opposition had very specific claims that just did not check out. And because I really did want to fact check both sides, the attack side was making lots and lots of mistakes, and I was on the air constantly about this isn't true, this isn't true. And because I did not want to appear to be taking sides, when I realized that the justices had messed up on their campaign, I was like, thank goodness. Because, I mean, it really isn't about taking sides. It honestly is about defending the truth. And then just very quickly, the other thing we did was to follow the money the best we could to show who was putting in money, where it was coming from, what their interests were. In one case, we found the Republican State Leadership Committee put in a couple of $100,000. We had been told that in-state corporations were being urged to give to the Republican State Leadership Committee, so it would be difficult to trace. We did find during the same time period a Tennessee nursing home chain that had given to the Republican State Leadership Committee. That nursing home chain had been mentioned in the Lieutenant Governor's PowerPoint, and so we did a story about what do they want. Well, in their case, they wanted to make it more difficult for the elderly to go to court in cases of neglect and abuse, and they wanted to force the families and the patients into binding arbitration. And so we were able to show, here's some money going into the campaign, here's what they want. And then the last thing is, I feel pretty good about what we did, but the lessons learned, I went to a lot of the normal, the expected sources and asked, what are you doing? Are you getting involved? Are you contributing? The one thing I neglected to do was to go to the state Republican, or the state parties and ask, are you contributing? Are you involved in this race? Because after the fact, well after the fact, we found out that the state Democratic Party had put in a couple of $100,000 into one PAC that was defending the justices. And that was something that I completely missed. No one knew about it until afterwards, and I wish I had known about it. So that's an overview.
All right, thank you so much. So Jorge, we would never see that kind of partisanship happening in North Carolina, would we?
Well, we do have, things get salty sometimes, but regrettably our lieutenant governor is not as talkative as Tennessee's. In fact, at least publicly, the state leaders tend to be, appear to be more, at least try to publicly be diplomatic. And for instance, right now, along with a lot of southern states, we're having a conversation about Confederate flags on license plates. And usually what happens when there's tense issues is that the Republicans at the General Assembly say that they really have the authority to write the laws, and the governor doesn't really have a say. So what happened in this case is that the governor said, I want the General Assembly to do something about this. We don't want this plate anymore. And the Senate leader, Republican Phil Berger, said, well, actually, it's the governor's job. So, I mean, there's like things when things get really hot, I mean, they try to be diplomatic about it. So in this case, regrettably, I mean, I couldn't really find very many leaders who were outside of the judiciary, who are outside of candidates, who are willing to talk about it very openly. And the stories that I covered were in particular with a couple of races that we had last year for the Supreme Court. We had 4 open seats. My job, what I do most of the time is that I cover a policy at the state level, so I cover the General Assembly. But this story with the Supreme Court was unavoidable because I saw an ad on television that was really dark and very doomy, saying that there was a justice who was not tough enough on crime, and there was a picture of a swing set at a playground, and I mean, basically, it made it seem as if the justice liked pedophiles, basically. So this is a story that was inescapable, and so I started educating myself on this, and just to give you a little bit of context before I tell you what I found in these particular races that we had last year, was that North Carolina, since 2001, had nonpartisan, publicly funded elections. And then in 2011, we had a massive, we had a wave that overturned the General Assembly, and we got a supermajority of Republicans in the House and in the Senate. And like Phil said, I mean, at least for me as a reporter, this isn't about conservative or liberal, but it's simply about whatever the facts are presenting and whatever the truth is. And generally what I think nationwide, and certainly we've seen in North Carolina, is that in general, Democrats tend to favor these nonpartisan elections and these publicly funded elections. So in 2011, the change that we saw was that public funding was eliminated, so then candidates could start raising money. So then in 2012, we had one seat in the Supreme Court that was heavily influenced by what appeared to be spending from outside of North Carolina that went to the Republican contender in that case. And then in 2014, then that's when we had this case that I was covering, which was initially started at the primary. So at the primary, we were seeing spending of upwards of $500,000 on TV ad buys, which in North Carolina is just ridiculous to see that kind of spending for a primary for a court. So the incumbent in this case was Justice Robin Hudson, and her main opponent was Judge Eric Levinson. So again, nominally nonpartisan, but Hudson was a Democrat. Levinson was a Republican who'd been serving at a lower court. And the ad in particular, when I talked to Justice Hudson about it, she was quite distressed because the ad, not surprisingly, had actually distorted the facts. She had written a minority opinion, so this actually was not in the ruling opinion. She wrote a minority opinion that said that basically that her opinion was that it was unconstitutional to apply laws to people who were convicted before the law was passed. And the plaintiff in this case happened to be somebody who had been sent for prison for crimes against minors. So the interpretation of that was, well, Justice Hudson wants to help pedophiles, basically, when really that was really not the case. so then where the money was coming from, just to pick up on a thread that Viveka gave during her original presentation, was we did get about $1.2 million from the Republican State Leadership Committee that was being funneled to another committee that was very difficult, whose money was difficult to trace, called Justice for All North Carolina. And most of this spending was going into this seat again for Justice Hudson, Democrat, and Judge Eric Levinson. And also, then we had, in the general election, we had another seat that got a lot of money from these out-of-state contributions. And it was the case of Justice Sherry Beasley, who had been appointed in 2012 by then Democratic Governor Beth Perdue, before we had a Republican governor who came in 2013. Justice Beasley was one of two women in the court, happened to be the only minority on the court. And this case actually almost went to a recount. I mean, she won basically by a few hundred votes out of millions of votes cast. And now to what we've seen since then is that the General Assembly has sort of followed, like they've done this past spring. They just did like step 2 after eliminating public funding. The next step that they did is that our races are going to be partisan. So that's one thing that happened in the spring. And then also more recently, there have been some members in the General Assembly who've actually been trying to do this for a very long time. There's Representative Leo Daughtry, who has been filing, he's a Republican, so he's in the majority now, and he's been filing these types of bills since the 90s, in which he was, I'm sorry, I'm getting two different things mixed up. That's right. So he wanted. So he's been advocating for retention elections, and the way that he originally filed a bill that was for the Supreme Court and for the Court of Appeals, and ultimately the bill that was signed into law by a governor was a bill that will allow for retention elections at the Supreme Court level and will not allow it for the Court of Appeals. What's interesting about this that I haven't been able to really dig into, because this is recent, is that, as you know, retention elections generally tend to make it easier for the incumbents to be able to stay in their seats. Well, what happens is that in the Supreme Court is majority Republican right now, so likely would keep the Supreme Court that way, whereas the Court of Appeals is majority Democratic. So it would allow for that to be able to change more easily. So that's what we have right now, and that takes us to today.
Thank you. And Pamela, you've been looking into all sorts of shenanigans around the country lately, haven't you?
Parachuting.
Yeah. Tell us about it.
Okay, cool. So I think I'm here because I wrote a story about Wisconsin, and so I thought I would talk about that. And the situation in Wisconsin is pretty complex, but it's also pretty unique in the way in which sort of special interests and outside spending hasn't just helped shape the court, but it's basically turned the court into this bizarre, dysfunctional place. I was talking to one expert when I was writing this story, and the way he described it was so good I put it in my story, and he said, it's like watching a slow-moving car wreck. And he said, I can't think of another court where we've seen anything like this. So just to give you a taste, and maybe you guys are probably read up on this a little bit, but to give you a taste of sort of what the Supreme Court in Wisconsin looks like right now, and then I'll sort of step back and say how we got there. There was the time in 2010 when one of the justices, he's considered one of the conservatives on the court, his name is David Prosser. At the time there was a liberal chief justice on the court, and he called her a total bitch and threatened to destroy her. And sorry to swear, but I'm just quoting the justice. The next year, The same justice got in some trouble. Well, he was accused of putting his hands around the neck of another liberal justice in an argument. He says he didn't do that. She says he did. He was never really sanctioned. But the liberal justices, who are 2 women on the court, later said that they were so concerned for their safety that they started having Capitol Police escort them to their offices, and they started locking their office doors after hours. At the time that I wrote this story, maybe 6 weeks ago, there was a situation where the liberals and the conservatives actually wouldn't appear in public together. So, I mean, this is truly hit levels of, I don't know, what, like a Will Ferrell movie or something? I don't know. But like the problem is that right now the Wisconsin Supreme Court has a really important case in front of it. And it's a case that could have really big ramifications for campaign finance in Wisconsin. Could have a large impact on the money that goes into electing judges. And it could have a really big impact on Governor Scott Walker, who's about to officially start running for president. So that's what the court is going on at the court right now, and this is what's on their plate. So I'm going to now step back a little bit. Basically, and I'm sure this has been talked about all day, but starting 10, 15 years ago, folks, a lot of them on the conservative side of the aisle, but not entirely, started realizing that they could further their policy goals if they started electing judges who were friendly to those goals. And the folks in Wisconsin really took that to heart in 2007. And 2 conservative groups started pouring a lot of money into Supreme Court elections. And they won a race in 2007, they won a race in 2008, and they won a race in 2011. And they spent, I think over $10 million in those last 8 years or so. And they have a majority on the court, a 4-3 majority. And so those same, they were doing so well with that they thought, well, we'll elect a governor too. And they did it. So they got Scott Walker in 2010. And then Scott Walker boldly went out and he weakened public sector unions. And then he faced a recall election. And those groups said, we got you, Scott Walker. And they put a lot of money into making sure that he was reelected, and he was. And this is sort of, I'm not just going off on a tangent, this is where it all sort of comes together. Prosecutors in Wisconsin said, hang on a minute, I think you guys might be illegally coordinating these sort of outside dark money conservative groups. I think you guys might be illegally coordinating with the Scott Walker campaign. We're going to have to look into that. And the problem is that in Wisconsin, there are limits on how much you can donate to a candidate. But if a candidate can coordinate with an outside group that gets unlimited anonymous donations, it sort of ruins the whole point of having campaigns donation limits. So the prosecutors started to look into that. These outside groups, and the 2 main ones, I'll say that's the Wisconsin Club for Growth and Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, which is basically like the state chamber of commerce. One of them, at least, said, well, we don't really want you to do this investigation, so we're going to go to court and try to stop this investigation. So, of course, that goes up to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, where it is now. And so you're probably thinking, well, that's kind of a conflict of interest, right? Because you have a group that's gone to court to say, please stop investigating us for illegal activity, and they're depending on judges whom they spent about $10 million to elect. But no one is recusing themselves, which would sort of seem to be what you're supposed to do in this kind of situation. And in fact, it is what you're supposed to do in this kind of situation. And so the last thing I'll just say is I'll explain to you why they're not doing that, and that I think kind of nicely brings home the degree to which the Wisconsin Supreme Court has sort of been hijacked very successfully by these outside groups. So, really quick sidebar. In 2009, the Supreme Court came down with a really important decision. They basically said that there are serious problems with a judge presiding over a case that involves someone or an entity that spent money to elect them. And it's serious enough that it can be unconstitutional. And as a result of this decision, state courts around the country were like, okay, I guess we're going to update our ethics guidelines so that we make sure we aren't violating the Supreme Court and the Constitution. Wisconsin did not do that. Wisconsin sort of did the opposite. What Wisconsin did is that one of these groups, one of these same groups that that donated to the Supreme Court they didn't donate to the Supreme Court justices, they spent outside money to elect them. The same group that is one of the same groups that we believe is under investigation, one of the same groups that has spent a lot of money to elect Scott Walker, they submitted proposed guidelines to the Supreme Court, and the guidelines said, look, just because someone gives money to a justice or to help elect a justice doesn't mean that you need to recuse yourself. And the judges said, yeah, we'll go with that. And they adopted those rules. So you have a situation, it's hard for me, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but it's hard for me to understand how those rules are really even constitutional and how they square with Supreme Court precedent. But you basically have a situation where a dysfunctional court is about to render a decision on basically the legitimacy of campaign finance laws in the state. And they're doing that because their ethics guidelines were written by the same people that helped elect them. And that's the story. So we're going to see what happens. We're going to see what happens. But yeah, that's Wisconsin. So if you live there, I'm sorry. There you go.
So we're going to get into a little bit of discussion now. I encourage you, if you have questions, to write them down and hold it up. Someone will come by and pick it up for us. For starters, though, I'd love to just sort of go down the line and ask you all, how much discretion do you have in deciding what stories you cover? And did anyone try to dissuade you from talking about these issues?
I have a lot of discretion. Since I edit the blog, I kind of run the blog, so I really have a lot of discretion. But usually I don't write about state races. It was only because the Daily Beast was very interested in this, because I had kind of covered these issues before, and because it was sort of an extension of the dark money issues we were covering at the federal level that I got into this. But on the whole, when it comes to the federal level, I have a lot of discretion.
Yeah, I have a fair amount of discretion. I don't run anything, but yeah, I brought these stories to my editors, and they said, go. So that was great. I think the only people that have ever discouraged me from writing a story would be the White House press corps, or the White House press folks. So no, I haven't had any problems about that.
I have a great deal of discretion, although certainly I have editors or management. I think, again, one of the challenges was when we started down this road, our promotions people looked at the first script, and they went to our my boss and said, "We're not sure about promoting this because he's taking sides in this race." And so we had to kind of educate them about, no, we're not taking sides, we're defending the truth. So there's in my position, there's a certain amount of buy-in that you have, and a certain amount of selling you have to do to be able to kind of branch out of our normal area of activity.
Well, for me, it's a two-part answer. The first part is my editor gives me a lot of liberty on what I cover and gave me freedom to pursue this last year. But the second part is that it also depends on what's going on in my normal beat covering state policy. And when the General Assembly's in session, I'm getting bombarded every single day with sometimes dozens of bills. So it just depends on how much time I can carve out of what I'm normally doing.
How aware do you think the public is of these issues, and how much did you feel like you had to provide background information to kind of help the public understand what you were reporting?
I provide a lot of help. I think I'm in a slightly different boat than especially these two, because they seem to be more focused on a particular state. So I do need to give a lot of background, and I hope that part of what I can offer on these sort of things is to sort of paint a big picture of what's going on. So I'm doing less of I'll sort of keep updating now that I'm working on these stories. I'll sort of, as they're just developments, I'll sort of keep updating. But a lot of times when I'm diving into these issues, instead of doing daily updates of each ad as it comes out, I'm sort of able to give a lot of context and sort of present the full picture. And so that requires a lot of background.
I think this really made me aware that, by and large, the public isn't very well educated on a lot of elections that go on in this country. I wish I had more time to watchdog and fact check more elections, because I think the public sees the ads and the public really doesn't know what to believe most of the time. And so, I mean, this was partly an educational endeavor, of educating the public of the importance of the judges, the issues that are coming before them, and how the public is affected by these issues.
I think when you get to the nexus of campaign finance and legal issues, those are two really complicated areas, and the public does not know much about the rules on campaign finance, the difference between a super PAC and a dark money group, or any of that. They also don't know, as Phil was mentioning, the finer points of the law, and if there's an ad that accuses somebody of helping a rapist get out of jail, that's really not quite what happened, because the lawyer was probably just trying to assert their constitutional rights in court, or have a rape kit tested, or something like that. So I think that, between those two areas, you really need to give a fair bit of background and try to simplify as much as you can without dumbing it down.
And I think it's part of the educational process. The nursing home example that I mentioned, I think you have to find ways to educate the public about why does this matter to you, because otherwise, you have attack ads, and for most people it becomes background noise, and people take sides depending upon how outrageous the message is sometimes. And so if you can figure out ways to say, here's why this matters. And in the case of the nursing home, the nursing home chain wanted to be able to take these abuse and neglect cases out of the court system. And so, that was a really good example of this is why this matters. And I think anytime you're trying to educate people about fairness in elections, that's the key thing to do, is to figure out how to educate the public about why this matters.
Well, for me, I think I recognized that this was largely, like Phil said, an educational effort, but I still think that I came short of educating people with that. Just for starters, I think I realized that a lot of people don't even realize that they can elect their judges locally in trial courts and appellate courts. At least that was what I found. So I think that the trick is to be able to find cases in which it's a little bit more tangible, like, for example, these death row cases that Phil was mentioning. In my case, what I did, and some of the stories that I did, some of the packages that I put together, and some of the live sort of longer explainers that I did, was to talk about we have this this voter ID case in which, starting in 2016, you're going to have to show your ID to be able to cast the ballot. Well, there are cases in federal courts, there are cases in the state courts. The state courts are going to decide some of them, and some of them are actually crossing over. They're coming from the federal side to the state side, or from the state side to the federal side. So that was the case that I used. But I still feel like I had that it was a shortcoming of mine, because it still is not as clear as it is when you show that there are two people on death row who maybe could deservedly stay there or be executed or deservedly be exonerated.
All right, so I've gotten a few questions. How hard is it to follow the money? Excuse me, and the person notes, the nursing home story is fantastic, but it seems very rare that we hear anything so concrete, especially about how things are impacting the poor and the elderly. How can we get more stories like that?
It's tough.
It's really hard. I was going to say, one of the things that I thought was interesting when I was looking into Wisconsin is Wisconsin has some good folks there that do a lot of work in sort of trying to tally the money that's spent on these races. And so one of these groups for years had been sort of, okay, this group ran these ads and probably paid this much, and so they sort of come up with these estimates, and they go, we think they spent $1 million. And then a memo, an internal memo from one of these groups leaked, and then the group had to go, well, we were wrong. It was actually this much more. we were being too conservative. So I think, just it is really hard, and there are people, there are journalists and there are watchdog groups doing a lot of it, and sometimes an internal memo leaks and you realize you got it wrong.
And, sometimes you cannot necessarily trace the money, but if you can educate the public about the people who are involved in raising the money or in sort of the behind-the-scenes players, that gives you some clues as well. One of the people who was involved in this judicial accountability group and had been involved in a second group, we found YouTube video of him talking about the need for tort reform. And so, we were able to say, here's one of the people behind it and here's what he wants. So, we could not track, a significant amount of the money, but we could tell you who the players were.
Yeah, you very rarely get that smoking gun where, somebody says, well, I would, if I give you this, will you give me that, once you get elected. So that almost never happens, but, as Phil was saying, you can find out what the interests are when there's disclosure, at least, or when you find out who's behind the money. You can find out what their interests are and what they may have argued for before.
So we have a question here wondering if you all would have an opinion on, is the issue with dark money disclosure that the IRS won't change the rule because both sides use it?
Well, the IRS is actually, I think the main issue right now is the IRS is pretty intimidated. Because after the so-called scandal of a few years ago when the IRS was targeting Tea Party and other groups and some liberal groups for additional scrutiny in their applications for nonprofit status, there was such a firestorm, and there have been endless hearings. I think there's still hearings going on about it. And I think the IRS feels like any time they step into the political arena, they get slapped back big time. So I think that is one of the problems. They put forward some draft rules last year. Neither side liked those draft rules. But I don't think it's so much because both sides use it as because politically it's almost suicide.
So voters seem to be aware of and concerned about the corrosive influence of money in politics. But we haven't always seen that translate into demand for specific reforms, whether that's merit selection, recusal, public financing. Do you have thoughts on why?
I think it's still sort of a new phenomenon, not new, but in terms of the public's awareness, I think sort of worrying about, I think there's always sort of been like, oh, I don't trust a politician kind of thing, but I sort of think that, Citizens United was probably a big turning point, but those things just sort of take time. So I still kind of think it's to be determined if ultimately there's action.
People tend to be motivated by major scandal.
Yeah.
I'm not sure we have had, the major scandal that, creates that tectonic shift in the public's thinking.
Yeah, I was actually discussing that with a colleague recently, sort of like, when are we going to get the big scandal that...
Right.
That's
coming.
Are any of you working on that story right now?
It's coming, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm just cynical, but I don't think it's about, yeah, maybe we do need a huge scandal, because the thing is that, I just don't see like the political willpower really for this to, at least where I'm reporting, for this to change. For example, these retention elections, the representative who got this passed has been working on it for more than 20 years, and I'm sure it's like that across the country and other places. So I don't know, I just don't see the willpower. Because there's always going to be somebody whoever's ahead is always going to think that they can stay ahead if they keep it the way that it is.
I think the public, people always say they don't like the amount of money in politics, but they tend to vote on other issues. This is not an issue that they cast their ballot on. Usually it's more, sort of pocketbook issues, the economy or civil rights even, or something else. So I think there's that factor, plus the lack of a scandal so far since Citizens United, although again, I'm sure it won't be long. And people also don't like their tax dollars being used for public financing. People generally don't like politicians just as an abstract concept, even if they like particular politicians, and they don't want their tax dollars being used to help elect them. So that's a problem too.
All right, this is an interesting one. Is there a difference in effectiveness of truthful versus untruthful ads in judicial elections?
Studies have shown that in general in elections, and I think this would carry over to judicial elections, that attack ads are more often untruthful, and attack ads tend to be more effective than other kinds of ads. So, unfortunately.
And honestly, I think in our situation, our involvement changed the dynamic. Tennessee is a very deep red state, and as I mentioned earlier, I was a little reluctant about how was the public going to perceive this. What was I just going to be destroyed on Facebook or in the comments section? But because we did sort of stake out, okay, is this person telling the truth or is this person not telling the truth, and picking very black and white issues, it worked. And then, I was, pleasantly surprised that people on Facebook were saying, "You're right, you caught him lying." And, but, I think those sort of attack ads only backfire if there is some very serious watchdog reporting.
Yeah, it's a rule of physics that observing something changes the nature of that thing. I'm wondering if you all have seen these stories change as a result of your reporting. This is something that you've alluded to. And kind of what was the follow-up, or what has happened since you've told these stories?
Well, in my case, I think the fact that we exposed the plan for a misleading attack early on probably resulted in not as much out-of-state money coming into Tennessee as the lieutenant governor had hoped, because that element of it was, probably in the minds of some was botched to the point of, okay, we're not going to pour $1 million. In the case of the Republican State Leadership Committee, they only poured a couple $100,000, which is pretty minor compared to what they did in North Carolina. So, I think that element of observation and watchdogging may have had some impact upon the amount of out-of-state money. And the lieutenant governor actually had to put in, and Alan Ramsey, I think about $400,000 of his own campaign money into the race because he had trouble raising money.
Vivica, was there a response to your Judicial Crisis Network reporting?
I wish I could say that the group went out of business or something. It didn't. It's still out there. It's still doing what it does. I think there was, a fair amount of positive response from readers. It's hard for us to tell because a lot of these groups work in the shadows, whether it's affected their fundraising or what, it may have increased their fundraising for all I know, But I think in general, though, that watchdog reporting like this does tend to tamp down some of the worst excesses, even if, at least I like to think so, even if, you're not blowing the town wide open.
I mean, I would like to think that my reporting is making a difference. I didn't see that to be the case. I mean, if anything, the relationship that that perhaps some of these that the story by itself had with the people who were covering it, with me and other reporters, was just basically that the justices who were being attacked were sort of outspoken about how distressed they were that they basically had a second full-time job raising all this money to be able to keep up with these companies that are funneling money into committees to put ads against them. And it was this thing that, for me, I thought it was just like almost bizarre. I mean, they literally went on tour to the 3 biggest markets in the state to talk to reporters about how awful this was for them. And then on the other side, the candidates who were the beneficiaries of it were reserved about it, and they said that they couldn't opine about whether or not this was right because it was something that they would perhaps have to issue a ruling on at some point.
Have you heard response? I'm curious, both response from within Wisconsin as well as from your national readership.
I think, I don't know, maybe I'm more cynical about this stuff. Like, I think that when you have groups, and it can be on either side of the aisle, but, in Wisconsin, at least it's been these conservative groups that have been really active. They have really clear goals about what they want to do, and they're not apologetic about it. And there's a really strong infrastructure of conservative media in Wisconsin that sort of has their back all the time. And it's the ends justify the means very much. There's a lot of I'm sure I don't know how much money these groups have made off of winning Supreme Court decisions and stuff, but I'm sure it's not insignificant. So I think on some level they're sort of like, well, yeah, maybe Mother Jones will yell at us and whatever. So no, I didn't notice any impact really, but I do think it's important, just sort of in a broader sense, that people read about these things and are aware of them, and even if it means just going back to their state and being like, whoa, Wisconsin's messed up, what's happening here? Mm-hmm. And so I hope that it has that kind of effect especially.
Great. So the panelists have all done a great job of investigative reporting, but I'm wondering how they feel about the ability of journalists to spend the time and money to do extensive investigative reporting on the state level. Anybody have thoughts on that?
It's a challenge. It is a serious challenge. So sometimes I get really frustrated because I've been around long enough that I sort of have a really deep understanding of all of the different areas of state government in Tennessee that affect people's lives, areas that never get any scrutiny at all, just because there are not enough reporters around anymore covering state governments. I wish I could clone myself a few times over, because I think there's a lot that's happening on the state level that is getting missed.
I think there's a few people in this room who would like to be able to clone you as well. All right, we have just a couple of minutes left, so I want to ask, if you'll forgive me, the money question here. which is we have a room full of advocates here and issue experts, and they're wondering, are they helpful to you, and how can they help and work with you more effectively?
I have one thing. This came up recently in a story that doesn't have to do with the courts, but I was frustrated, and so I'm speaking to that person who's not here. Basically, someone called me up and was like, oh, this is like a really interesting phenomenon that's going on, and it had to do with healthcare. And I was like, oh, this is fantastic. I'm going to write about this. And then my editor said, yeah, no, you can't write about that because it's not timely. If you had written about that the day after the Supreme Court upheld the Affordable Care Act, great. But that was 2 weeks ago, so you lost your time hook. So I wish that person had told me in a more timely fashion that this was a thing. So one thing I would say is like sometimes like we're totally hungry for like the sort of like stories that you guys have, and we'll want to like relay them. But don't like wait 5 days after the court decision or something and like tell me about it. Like tell me about it when you're like, hey, this is going to happen in 3 days, and I'm like, great, I have 3 days. So that's just my tip is that like help me help you by like not blowing deadlines. Yeah.
All right.
So now I'm like sitting around being like, when is this healthcare thing going to come up again? I really want to write about it. So mostly I'm bitter at someone who's not here, but yeah.
Jorge, how about you?
Well, I think I will say something nicer than Pema, which is just please contact me. Please, I beg you, please contact me. Because, I mean, I just spent so much time like sorting through like the middle of, through various bureaucratic levels, trying to find somebody who is willing to talk to me, and most people are resistant. Maybe they just don't like reporters, or maybe they're just worried about their job being jeopardized. But please, I mean, if there's a reporter who you see who's covering an issue that you think is important, send that person like a short email. If you don't want to put it in anything in writing, send them a couple of sentences and ask them to call you. I mean, sometimes that happens to me, and I'm super, super grateful, and I will call them back, or I'll email them back. So we could do it offline, we could do it in person. I don't get that a lot, but when I do get it, I get really happy, because I spend a lot of my own time trying to look for those people who like know stuff and are willing to share it, even if it's just on background, so I can go corroborate it elsewhere.
Great. Phil?
Two things come to mind. One, cultivate relationships with talented journalists who you think understand the issues. One of my pet peeves is when someone calls me up and they try to sell me on a story, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to drop everything. This is a really good story, and then I sort of, as an afterthought, almost I asked, well, have you shared this with anyone else? And they were like, oh yeah, we called your competitors too. And so I don't like being played. If you want to develop a relationship and to really explore an issue, don't hold a gun to my head that I'm working with your competition, so either you play or you miss out on the story. And then the other thing is, I'm always open for tips and suggestions, but just remember, I'm not on your side. And in this case, after this election was over, someone called me up and said, hey, we're going to have a little celebration. We'd like for you to be there. Mm-hmm. And I was like, no, that's not what I do. I wasn't trying to help you win or your side win. I'm not on your side. And so just kind of, remember kind of our rules, our ethical principles, and just kind of be respectful of that.
Great. And Vivek, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. Call us, try to be timely.
I love help. I wasn't trying to be mean. Just, it would be helpful.
Yeah, I agree with, if you call us, don't also call our competition. But we do love to hear from people who are thoughtful, who really know what's going on. We get our share of calls from people whose husbands are $100,000 in arrears in child support and want us to do a story about the Miami child support system. And just think about where you're calling and what that person covers or what that outlet covers. And, you know, we're always open to a good story.
All right. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists. And I believe we have ice cream out that way.